Okay, welcome to episode 126 of an Evolving Man podcast. Today I'm delighted to be speaking to Nicky Moxey and Dr. Linda Devereux. Nicky is an ex-boarder, originally spent 33 years as a project manager and Agile coach. She is retraining as an integrative counsellor and intends to work with boarding school survivors after she qualifies. Linda Devereux is a third culture kid with more than 40 years of teaching experience in schools and universities. Linda is an adjunct research fellow at Charles Sturt University, Australia, where she researches and publishes in the fields of transcultural childhoods, life narrative, boarding school, and the transition to university. And they are also the editors of a new book about third culture kids. So, welcome, Nicky. Welcome, Linda. So, how I'd love for us to begin the podcast is just to kind of define what is a third culture kid, please.
Well, thank you, and thank you for having us to talk about these things and to talk about the book. The accepted definition generally of a third culture kid was one that was put by Ruth Van Recken and David Pollock, and they define a third culture kid as someone who's spent a significant part of their developmental years living in a country that's not their passport country. Other people have called these individuals different things. Joy Shavarian calls them exiles, and other people have used names like global nomads. So, although there's controversy about the terminology "third culture kid," it's the one that's probably most widely known. So, it's the one that we used. Mm.
Mm, thank you. Thank
We
you.
were also quite surprised when we looked at the data that we got from people's stories that there seemed to be three broad categories of third culture kids as well. So we have Missionary, which Linda's childhood was part of. We have mercantile or business, which was mine. And then we also have military. And there's been a fair amount of research on the military and also the missionary, but less so on the mercantile.
Mm, mm. Thank you. Thank you. It's interesting. I lived in Africa for about a year and I connected with a lot of the expats who were the mercantile,
Yeah.
but I never really thought at the time, well, what about their children? And I
Mm.
presume a lot of them were sent back to boarding school.
It was often part of the perks of the job.
Mm.
Perks of the job.
So I'd love for us to segue into what drew you both into editing, writing this book about third culture kids.
So I went on one of Nick Duffell's boarding school survivor workshops just after the end of COVID. And at that workshop, the eight of us women came out of it furious because as children we were sold the idea of boarding school through Enid Light and Mallory Towers, that kind of thing. And we decided we really wanted to get our voice out to support the work of people like Nikki Simpson, who'd already put out a great women's book. And that was the genesis of it. So I started collecting stories from people. Um, Simon Partridge, I think, introduced me to both Suzanne Zeedyk, who's written the chapter on attachment theory for the book, and later on Linda, whose work on pulling the themes together and doing the analysis on the stories, I think has absolutely made the book what it is.
Mm, thank you, Nikki. And what about you, Linda? What drew you into wanting to be involved in this project?
Well, when Nikki first approached me, she asked if I wrote a personal story first of all, and we started talking about our third culture kid backgrounds, and I think I might have offered to write a chapter on third culture kids. And then, look, I was just it was such a great thing to be part of. It's obviously an issue that's very dear to my heart, and um, I felt welcomed into the project. Nicky and the other contributors were incredibly generous in sharing their stories with me and giving me the opportunity to work with them to look at what some of the things were that we might have had in common and some of the things that maybe were different in our experiences. So it was a very satisfying thing to be part of, and I'm just very grateful for the generosity of people that were prepared to share their story and let their lives be pinned to the page, as some people have said about life writing.
Mm. Mm. Thank you. Thank you. I think I can't remember if it's in Suzanne's chapter. She says about, I know she talked about it in the documentary, the importance of telling our stories.
Mm.
And, I'm hearing that's what you're saying there, Linda, the importance of putting things down onto page and how healing that can be. Whether that's just for ourselves to begin with, to tell that story, or, then to actually put it into a book.
Yes, I think different people had different reactions to the process of writing. I know some people found it very hard, and Nicky really had to coax people. Some people presented the information verbally, and then Nicky wrote it down and gave it back to them to comment on. But for me and for a couple of other people, the process of writing is a healing process. For me, externalizing the experience, putting the words on a page, actually stops it going on and on in my head. It feels like I can put it in a different place somehow, and it often also helps me to clarify ideas. I've always found writing really helpful for clarifying my ideas, for seeing where my stories connect with other people and that kind of thing. That's been a really healing and helpful process for me.
And
Thank you.
I also think a lot of our people, me included, were dissociated, and the first telling of their story was affect free. There was no feelings involved, and then I could feel people realizing that what had happened to them was not okay, and that there was damage inflicted. Still, every time I read the stories, I cry and I want to hit people on people's behalf. It's really an emotional experience for everyone involved, putting those stories on paper.
Yeah, yeah, it's a powerful response to tears and, you know, wanting to lash out. And I can resonate having read so many over the years. Even people who are like a David Cameron reading his story, and you're like,
Poor little kid. Yeah.
7 years old,
Yeah.
and how he calls it is brutal and bizarre.
Yeah, lost a stone in his first term. That was my experience too. Just
Mm. So I'd love for us to kind of segue into that question about uh, s- please speak to how many of the women miss their homelands and how much this negatively impacted their impressions of the UK.
I think everybody who lived overseas found it the most amazing wrench, because all of us went from freedom in clothing. I didn't own a pair of shoes apart from dress up ones until I was 11. Um, we were able to be children overseas, to play, to be in the sunshine. And then you come to England and it's cold, it's wet, it's grey. Coming for me, coming from the plains of Africa, houses in England are still right in your face. So I find it very difficult to find space to breathe in the UK still. I came when I was 11. Um, and yeah, we just lost everything: culture, climate, food, freedoms, as well as our families. It's just such a multiplicity of blows for someone who comes from a different climate and a different culture.
Mm. Linda.
Yes, I think one of the things that really struck me when I started reading the stories, because I came into this process later than Nicky and I hadn't heard them before, was how much the women talked about the places where they'd lived, and they talked about it in really sensory ways, and apparently that's how children do experience places, very much through their senses. And you can see that people talk about the bodily sensations, the tastes of things, the sounds, the way the light sparkled in countries where the sun shines more than it does in the UK. So as Nicky said, it was just such a huge contrast and such a huge loss. And of course, they were so far away from their families that it wasn't just the loss of home, and it was the loss of homeland, but it was the loss of easy contact with everything that was familiar as well. And one of the other things that really struck me was how few people were able to go back. Nicky and I have talked about this. Neither of us have been able to go back to the African countries where we lived as children because it's not safe, or we can't get there, or there wasn't permission. But for some of the people who wrote stories for the book, the parents divorced while they were in boarding school, and so the family split up, and they never got to say goodbye to those countries that had meant so much. And for others, the family moved on, moved to another country, and set up a life there that they weren't part of. So that was a huge wrench, and perhaps one that's been under recognized in the literature up until now.
Mm, mm, thank you. Yeah, that must be such a huge, you know, you mentioned your dog, Nikki, and, not being able to, I think I was in Australia at the time when my dog died.
Mm.
It was in between, and I kind of reflected on this. It's maybe a bit similar to what you guys experienced. I went to school in January, and then the Easter holidays, I went to Australia, where I'd got quite a lot of families, and my dog died while I was in Australia. And then obviously I went home in the summer, but I was thinking I probably only spent a week with my family in 6 months. But that's probably quite a common experience for children who were third culture because you couldn't easily just go home.
Mm. Yeah,
Mm,
No,
and
it,
the consequence of that was, being very few children in a school at an exit weekend, for instance, rattling around like peas in a pod. It was safer, but it was very quiet.
mm,
mm, yes, or some people got farmed off to other relatives that they didn't perhaps know very well, or and when they did go home for the long holidays, the travel wasn't always very safe. They got sent off on their own in taxis, and then dropped at airports and had to make their way through airports, if they were lucky, with some support from what were called the airport aunties. But the terror in that comes across in those stories is very visceral. I think it was too much for such little people to bear on their own. Mm.
mm. It's interesting as you speak, Nikki. One of the wake-up calls for me to boarding school was that first leave day. Everybody's families came, picked their children up, and my mother's car broke down, so I wasn't picked up. So I had to stay in the school for an extra 3, 4 hours. And it was at that point that I realized it felt a bit like Pinocchio when he goes onto Pleasure Island and then he goes behind the scenes to see everyone's being turned into donkeys. And I suddenly got that impression that was what was happening to me. Suddenly there was space
Mm.
and I was seeing behind the workings that, oh my God, I really don't like the feel of this place because I've been busy for 3 weeks doing, doing, doing. Suddenly I had a chance. I'm like, I miss my mum. I want to go home now. But you guys would have experienced that every 3 weeks when everyone else had leave days
Mm.
or, going off to not a safe place necessarily.
Yeah.
How was that being in the school on your own or a couple of other people?
I was very badly bullied from pretty much my first week at school. So for me, there was a lot of relief in it. You know, the people who were my tormentors had gone largely. Um, the kid who had the bunk above me at school went to relatives each time, and being able to move around in my bed was an incredible relief. Um, yeah, I've always been a reader and have escaped into books as the thing that I do, and it was luxury just having to be places at meal times, and then the rest of it, nobody cared. So you know, my school was about 8 hours, 8 miles away from the beach. And I used to walk off to the beach dressed in school uniform along the dual carriageway, the high bank. Nobody ever stopped me. So you know, that's where I spent sunny exeat weekends
Mm.
pretty much through my entire time at school, clutching a book. Don't think I even had a drink. Nobody would have thought to give me pocket money to buy a drink or anything like that. So yeah, alone, vulnerable, but I didn't recognize it at the time, and at peace because none of the bullies were around, and the timetabling had stopped.
Mm.
Mm.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you, Nikki. What about you, Linda? How was it being? Did you stay at school?
I did, and I remember it. I remember being really upset. I was only 6. I wasn't. I was just beginning to read and write, and I didn't really understand that it was a 3-day drive from where my parents were to where I was at school. I didn't actually go to school in the UK. I went to school about about 800 kilometers away from where my parents were working because there wasn't a closer English language school. And I remember waiting at the gate, just waiting and waiting and seeing all these other cars come up the driveway and these other parents arrive and hug their children. And I was just hoping and hoping that mine would come. And I'd been told that they couldn't come, but you're so desperate, I think, when you've been so lonely that you just hope that everybody's wrong. And, you know, if you believe that your parents love you, you're just hoping that they'll find a way to get there. It was so I remember that as being a very, very lonely time
Mm.
and very sad. I felt very left out. It didn't feel like a good thing to me because I could see the other families all off doing nice things or taking their children out for the day, and I was stuck behind.
Mm.
Mm.
Thank you, Linda. That sounds so sad to be doing that at 6 years old.
Mm.
Wow. So I'd love for you to talk a little bit about the research. You know, you talked a little bit, but how children have a very sensory response to the place, which impacts how they respond to new geographies for the rest of their lives. Can you talk a bit about that sensory impact, please?
Yes, well, this was a research paper by geographers, social geographers, who were writing about how young children learn about place through their senses and through play. And of course, the things that we learn when we're young tend to affect how we judge everything else in the future, as Nikki referred to earlier. So forevermore, those early memories of those special places will compare. I mean, adults do that too, don't they? You compare your new experiences back to the ones that you had in the past. And there's two aspects to this, apparently. There's the kind of geographical and physical aspects of place, but there's also the aspects of place that are to do with relationships and the very special things that we did with people. I suppose they're a form of positive childhood experience, really, where we have these memories, and Nikki and I have some very vivid ones of those special things that we did with special people when in those places that were so important to us. At that stage, most of us hadn't had many opportunities to compare them to other places, so that was all that we knew. So when we moved to boarding school, particularly those of us that moved to a different continent, everything was disrupted. Nothing was familiar anymore. and we couldn't share that with other people. I read Charles Spencer's book recently, and I noticed that he talked a lot about place too. But when he talks about place, people in the UK would find that familiar and they would be able to identify with the kind of things that he talks about. Whereas for third culture kids, often if they try to talk about those special places and the special things that they did, it's either seen as boasting or else people are just not interested because they can't, the other children and perhaps staff too, and are not interested because they can't identify with it. It's not a shared experience. So instead, that thing that's so very special to you and so dear to you that you want to keep close to you is not something that you can share with other people. It sometimes becomes something that's a bit shameful that you have to keep hidden along with everything else.
Mm. Mm. Interesting. As you speak, I'm remembering a guest, and I can't remember who it was exactly, but they were talking about how boarding school was very much black and white, and I think it was
Mm,
in the 70s. So when they went out, everything was in color. And that was definitely my experience
mm.
of my school. It was kind of very black and white. Yes, you had the green grass, but very little color because we were all in the same black and white uniforms with yellow socks. I mean, my uniform, as you've probably seen, was 16th century. And so we had woolen socks, woolen breeches to our knees, a long black coat. So we were all wearing this. People used to call us penguins when we go to visiting schools. So, yeah, interesting. Um, some of the other things you've talked about and questions which came up were stories, similarities and differences, both third culture kids. You've got Nicky Mercantile, Linda Missionary. You both grew up in Africa. Um, I'd love for you just to maybe talk about the similarities and differences between your experiences, please. Do you want to begin, Nicky?
I'm thinking that starting with that sense of place is probably the best way to do that.
Mm,
And just growing up knowing that a temperature of about 25 degrees Celsius is the right one, that that you've got lush green growth all around you. You have spaces. Um, yeah, my childhood was in Kenya on the top of the African plains, so for me horizons were endless. I can remember many camping exhibition expeditions lying watching stars rise, whereas Linda, I suspect that your experience in the what was the Congo was very different to that.
mm. Yes, it was. I remember when the first time I was taken back to Scotland with my mother and my younger brother, that seemed very open to me going on to Scottish because Scotland was where we grew up. The UK was my passport country. So when trouble began in Congo, that's where we were sent back by the British consul. And Scotland was that open place, you could climb a hill and see for miles, whereas where I lived in, in Congo, it was thick jungle right on the banks of the River Congo. So if when you were in the jungle, you couldn't see anything. The trees met over the top of the little pass, and it was almost dark because the sun couldn't penetrate it. So yes, those contrasts were very vivid for me. I think one of the other things that really struck me when you and I started talking about our experiences of Africa was, although it was a very free and childhood with lots of freedoms and outdoor play, there was also an underlying sense of tension or fear. And I think we both experienced that as people who were visitors in a country that wasn't their home. I guess particularly for me, there was a lot of tension because it was around the time of independence. And so very much that was a background to my early experience as well.
Mm.
Yeah, it wasn't that long after the Kenyan Mau Mau that we were around, and my father was did something during the Mau Mau, that resulted in becoming a honorary game warden as well as his day job. So that was, my benefit for that was to know the bush intimately and often, and for it to be part of me. It's still, I take comfort in woodland to this day.
Mm.
Mm. Mm.
And I love rain to this day because of the tropical downpours. Yes.
Any other similarities or differences between the mercantile and the missionary?
And do you want to pick up and talk about the expectations of the organization, Linda? That was something that you wrote about.
Yes, yes. I think that's one of the things that really stands out for missionary children and also for the military children too, is that and for perhaps some of the mercantile, that when your parents go to that country to work, they're often not working for people in that country. They're working for a sponsor organization that sends them there and therefore has a lot of control over decisions that are made about that family. And in often those organizations are quite bureaucratic, quite patriarchal. In the missionary organization, things were run by multiple committees. Some of the people on those committees had never been to Africa, had never been overseas, and yet they were making decisions about that had huge impacts on families and on children. Um, the whole decision to go to boarding school was a missionary decision in my case because it was the missionary organization's policy that children be sent to boarding school. And before me, almost everyone had been sent back to the UK. My parents bucked the system as much as they could. They'd lobbied to try and have a joint mission school set up close by so that at least I could come home at weekends. But in those days, the missionary organizations were struggling with finances. It wasn't like the heydays of a few generations earlier, and people were much more aware of the troubles with colonialism and white privilege. There was less money, so my parents sent me to this school that was in Africa, but still a very difficult place to get to for them. And the missionary organization made all sorts of other decisions that affected the family too. When my mother and my younger brother and I were evacuated back to Scotland, my father was forced to stay and work. So it was kind of the men could stay and work, but it was decided that it was too dangerous for the women and children. So we ended up living apart for almost a year. And decisions that, of course, my family wasn't the only one that was affected by those kind of things. Those kind of decisions appear to have been made with very little awareness of how that was affecting families and children.
Mm. Thank you. That
There's
reminds
a-
me, if you speak, please, Nikki.
I'm just thinking about the military experience. There's a film called, I think it's called Military Brats,
Mm.
where a teenager turns up at a new school and the kids ask her what her favorite place was, where home was, and she has no clue how to answer that. And anyone who's spent a childhood where you're bounced around couldn't answer that either. Her response is, well, do you want to know where I was born, where I'm living now, what my favorite place was? That the article that came out in the Observer recently, the woman at the top of it has had a hugely peripatetic childhood,
Mm.
very much a TCK. I don't know if she realizes it. And I absolutely recognize her confusion as to where home was that she wrote about.
Mm. Yeah, 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 yeah. I think so. I think on our retreats, thinking back now, certainly 3 out of the 10 retreatants were third culture kids, probably more. Um, but yeah, it's just, hearing people's stories. It's just, yeah, it's heartbreaking. And And it reminds me, as you're speaking there, the bureaucracy. I've been reading a couple of books. Well, I've been reading hundreds of books, but one in particular is Legacy of Violence, which is Caroline Elkin's take on the British Empire and what we did during those times, which were horrific. So it must have been quite difficult being a child growing up in a place where these atrocities had happened, which had kind of been pushed under the surface. But there must have been a bubbling fear because of what had happened with the Mau Mau or with other things, or maybe that wasn't a conscious thing. And then the other thing which comes to me is about Oranges and Sunshine, which is a film around Margaret Humphrey's work and about how I can't remember if it was the 50s and 60s, how children in care were sent to Australia without telling their biological parents. And so when the biological parents came to find them, they were like, oh no, they found a nice family when they hadn't. They'd just been put in boarding schools in Australia, really brutal ones. And just reminds me a bit similar. It's like that, not actually feeling into how that might impact the family.
Yes, I think that is true. There was a very little awareness of that, and as Nicky said, often people were moved at very short notice. All those decisions were made. The house that you lived in, uh, Donna Musel, the person who produced that film, remembers that as a military kid that she had to learn how to answer the phone in a way that was befitting to the standard of her father's rank, and which was stenciled on the door of their house. And had the great loss that she felt when she turned 18 and moved out of home. She wasn't able to go back because she lost her pass to go back to the compound. So there's that sense of that loss of the community. As at that The community was where a lot of people, militaries in particular, I think from some missionary groups as well, that community brought a real sense of stability and those positive childhood experiences, which again were lost completely when people were sent to boarding school a very long way away or in another country.
Yeah. The other thing for me was that the long holiday in Africa is over the Christmas period because that's when the summer is. And so even the very tentative friendships that I had made before going to boarding school, because we landed in Zambia, a new country, on my 10th birthday, were lost because these kids were either schooling locally or were schooling in South Africa, and we rarely met.
Mm.
My memory of holidays at wherever my parents were living was of being up a tree reading because there was no other kids around who I could talk to.
Mm, really sad. And it's interesting. My family was military, but because they were naval, my father would go on the ship for a year at a time, and we would stay in Portsmouth. And whereas if you were in the army or if you were in the RAF, you would go with your family because they would be working on a naval base or on an Air Force base or army base. Whereas, yeah, it's interesting. I could have been a third culture kid, but because he was in the Navy, it was him who was also an ex-border, so used to being away from home for a long time. Hmm. So I'd love for us to segue a little bit into why it was important to write a book about women's experiences. And, you know, less has been written about women's experiences. You've got Nikki Simpson's book, but obviously Joy talks about it a little bit in Boarding School Syndrome. But yeah, I'd love you to talk to that, please.
Yeah, I think it was not only that us women wanted a voice, but also because there was very little in the literature that made clear that women's and men's experiences were not only intrinsically different, but are designed to be different by the culture, by the hierarchy. Basically, my school was was a school for young ladies that still makes me giggle. But the purpose of it was to turn us into moderately well-educated but very submissive wives. You know, the focus of it was, who are you going to marry? Not what are you going to be? What can you do in the world? And a lot of the stories that people gave to us for the book echoed that. There's a woman who wanted to skip and was told that ladies don't skip. Wanted to go and play outside. Oh no, no, we only go out into those wonderful grounds in twos under supervision in a crocodile. Yeah, just stupid things like having to wear two pairs of knickers. You had under knickers and over knickers. I mean, what on earth is that message supposed to send to people? And you know, it wasn't that, you know, the school skirts in my uniform had to be 4 inches below the back of your knee. Another person had to kneel, and if your skirt didn't touch the floor when you knelt, then you know that was incorrect, and you were punished for having outgrown your uniform. Why didn't you, as a very young kid, go and get a new uniform? You know, it's just the women's experience is just appalling, and something that we absolutely have got nothing on. And we have one story in the book from someone who is no longer counting themselves as a woman or a girl. They're actually non-binary, and growing up in a culture that says you will become a good wife must be appallingly difficult for someone who absolutely rejects that mold. That might be the next book. I'd quite fancy taking that challenge on. But yes, the reason for writing a book about girls' experiences was that it's so different to the ones that you read about in the men's literature, like Campbell, like Lord Spencer. It's just a different planet.
Mm, mm, mm. Thank you, Nikki. Linda, what drew you to want to be involved in this around the women's perspective?
Well, I guess it was similar reasons to Nikki, that it was obvious there wasn't very much that was written about that. And the more we read from Joy Cheverian's work to others, lots of people commented on it, that there very little was known. And so in a way, we feel that what we've said is a bit of a start, but there's so much more that we need to find out. Because we didn't do interviews, we based our analysis on what people wrote. We weren't actually able to probe and ask questions. There's lots of things I would like to know too. There's only one of our contributors who talked about how awkward it was starting her periods at boarding school, because she was one of the first. I think she might even have been the first in her school, and she didn't feel able to confide in anybody. Nobody had talked about these things. She couldn't even tell her parents because it felt like something that was too shameful and private to write about in a letter, when she knew that letters were censored. So as such a young person, she was dealing with that on her own. And I'm sure every one of us would have a story like that if we were at boarding school at that time. But we don't have the depth of knowledge about that yet. But it is very clear from the stories that we do have that the expectations of women and men were very different. Joanna's, I think it's Joanna, did I get the right person? Nikki, you would know. Story illustrates that very clearly. She tells a story of a boy who, from a neighbouring school, who climbed into the bedroom of a head girl. Nothing went on. The girl hadn't asked him to come, but the next morning she was publicly shamed and immediately expelled, whereas the boy was just giving a ticking off. You know, there were it was very clear there were very different rules around behavior for young men and young women.
Mm,
Mhm.
mm. Thank you. Any other differences between the male and the female experience? I mean, I've heard of the shame, whereas boys often we were beaten. I mean, I'm kind of doing a meta-analysis of a lot of the biographies I have, and not everyone's sexually abused, but everyone that I've read is being beaten. The
Mm.
boys. I don't have so many biographies of women. I've got Emily Bronte, who interestingly went to boarding school. I think she
Mm.
based one of her stories on that. But any other differences between the male and the female experiences of boarding school?
And I think that those two things that you've highlighted, sexual abuse and punishment areas, are the two that stick out for me. Many of my men friends who have been to boarding school were sexually abused, and as you say, all of them were beaten. In my school, only one person or two people in my class were ever beaten because they were found in bed together. You know, lesbianism just was absolutely beyond the pale. And given that presumably 1 in 10 of us is lesbian or bi or what or whatever, the whole suppression of anything that wasn't vanilla, straight down the line of expectation that would be treated by shame and public humiliation. Shame was the punishment. Even stupid little things like talking after lights out that might have earned you boys a beating. For us, we had to clean the entire school's shoes, sat in the hallway, cross-legged on the floor, so that everybody walked past you and knew that you were being punished for something, and might deal out the stealthy kick on the way past. But that wasn't the point of it. The shame was the point of the punishment.
Mm.
Yes, and there was that real control that what Barbara Miller, I think it's Barbara Miller, somebody Miller, has called the poisonous pedagogy. That sort of uh, cr desire to break the child's will that often means that things happen very early at the first meal or on the first night or when the child first arrives at school. And there's very good examples of that in the stories in our book of people who were so humiliated because they didn't understand the culture, and it was obviously intended to be public. Kat's story is a great example of that. And Kat couldn't sleep on the first night in boarding school, trying to tire themselves out, jumped on the bed. The matron came in, and instead of punishing Kat privately, presumably the other children were all asleep by then, the matron put the light on and pulled down Kat's pajama pants and beat Kat, presumably waking all the other children up as well. So it was intended to be public, it was intended to be humiliating, and it was intended to break the child's will. I'm sure those things happen for boys as well. I don't know enough about it. You probably know that better than me, but certainly the humiliation is a very strong theme that comes through the stories for the people in our book.
Mm. So that was the first night of Cat. He was
The
Yeah.
beaten.
very first night, yes.
Wow.
Mm.
Wow. I've heard Richard Branson talk about that in his first night. He was 7, and he says that he was so upset he vomited on his
Mm.
bed, and matron came in and she told him to clean it up. No love, no hug, nothing. It was like, right, clean it up. You sort all of that out. And so just that, almost as I'm hearing your stories a lot, like you going down to the south coast and not having water, it's neglect.
Oh, absolutely. There's no pastoral care whatsoever. I don't think anyone, child or staff, touched me in 7 years
Mm.
with anything resembling affection or care.
Mm. Wow. And Joy says in her book, that's a serious deprivation and the lack of physical touch.
Yeah.
And the more I've studied kind of the neuroscience, but also Piaget, I saw an article, something by Piaget, Jean Piaget, the developmental psychologist today, and just saying how important touch is for developing a brain. And I think again, Sue Gerhard says again, we can't grow a flexible brain without good attachment, which isn't linked into touch, but I feel good attachment is really part of touch because you're able to go and get a hug from mummy or daddy and it not to be shamed. And, my school talking about lesbianism, to be gay was the ultimate evil. And I thought I was gay. And actually reading Joy's work, she's like, oh no, I was just missing mum. I just wanted touch. I wanted hugs. I wanted to have comfort and warmth. And yet, I think even Stephen Fry talks about that in his book, that he was called gay for just putting his arm around someone, helping them out of a pool. So, wow. Yeah. Amazing.
And of course, that was the ultimate insult.
Yeah. 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 Yeah, exactly. I think I remember I had a relationship with another boy on my second year, and he told someone else. And the guy came to me who he'd told and says he came to shame me and just, I heard this and I just lied. I said, absolute rubbish, nothing happened. But from that day forth, it was like, right, no contact with anybody else. Because for that have to got out into the school that would have been the next 6 years of my life to be hell.
Mm.
And it wasn't, it's like that rupture repair. You could almost rupture but there was never a repair.
Mm.
Okay, if you mess up like that, that's it. It's just rupture. There's no kind of, oh, let's let this go. It's just that's it.
Mm.
So, wow.
Yes, a theme that seems to be coming out there is one that I've heard in other interviews that you've done too, Piers, that it's only safe if you can conform, if you can be part of the narrow binaries and behave in certain ways. And one of the things we haven't really touched on yet is how hard that is for third culture kids, because if they've come from Africa or Asia to school in England, they actually don't know how to conform in those kind of ways. They haven't had that training in the subtleties of culture and school culture in the UK. And so from the minute they arrive, they stand out as different and odd. They can't tell the same stories. They can't reminisce about home in the same kind of way. So from the very first minute, it sets some of us up for bullying because we can't conform.
The
Mm.
British class system still blows my brain. I didn't grow up with it and I don't understand it to this day. And I apparently have far too broad a range of friends. But certainly that was part of school. There were the rich kids and the poor kids, and the rich kids usually were of a class that looked down on whatever the hell they thought I was.
Mm. Mm. Yeah. I'd love for you to share a little bit, Nikki, about that, how you've seen third culture kids fitting in and or not, that culture of conforming.
Absolutely not. And the expectation for all the children to be quiet, to be well behaved, to be sporty, to be academic to some extent, and to perform across all those categories is just something that a child who has had multiple losses before they walked in the door, has had their resilience blown away, just cannot achieve. Because anytime anything goes wrong, you get a C in a test instead of an A, that's a blow to yourself, to your personhood, that you can't recover from because you have no resilience. If it turns out that you're not very good at throwing a javelin or something equivalent, again, that's a blow. And unless you manage to find yourself some kind of niche that, I don't know, maybe you are the best javelin thrower in the school, you have no chance of fitting in to anything. And each one of those blows is another blow to your personhood. It's another way of submersing yourself so that Nick Duffell's strategic survival personality is what emerges. And I meet this time and time again with people who went to boarding school now in their 50s and 60s who still have this shell that I recognize. I'm now at the point where I can go turn up at a party and know the people who went to boarding school and go and talk to them about it because they are unmistakable.
Mm. Yeah, they are. They are. And it's almost like, for me, boarding school is that conforming, and yet you go home to a third culture or you've grown up in a third culture, your accent's probably different. So that's one immediately it's like any difference is not good. So
Mm.
you mentioned quiet, well behaved and, being able to be good at certain things. But then also, any difference, maybe I remember going to Australia for this holiday. My hair turned white because I'd been in the sun for the 5 weeks, as children's hair often did. And it's like, you know, what's wrong with him? You
Yeah.
know, I didn't get
Yeah.
bullied for that. But
If
yeah,
you'd
just
been swimming in a pool and you were blonde, your hair would be green, you know. Turning up at England with green hair is, yeah, don't want to think about how horrid that would be.
no. So the next question we've got is shame used as a tool as control. Um, we've talked about that a little bit. Anything you want to add about shame? About how that was used to control?
How ubiquitous it was, and both from the staff, teaching staff, as well as the boarding house staff, and also every girl in the school was shaming someone else.
Mm,
And if you were the bottom of the heap, then everybody was shaming you.
mm,
The pressure to comply, to force compliance by shame was astonishing. And even me, I was fairly much the bottom of the heap at boarding school, but I'm pretty certain that I passed some of that on to the day pupils because, of course, they were not human at all. So it was the done thing. Just appalling. The cruelties inflicted on us that they were then felt forced to perpetuate.
Mm, thank you, Nikki. Linda, anything else about shame that resonates for you?
Well, I think one of the things that seemed to come out in the stories was the shame a lot of women felt about their bodies. Somebody makes the comment that they felt like they were always on show and not in a good way, and somebody else recalls that the headmaster used to check in on the showers, and even though there were female staff there, they because of the way that patriarchy works, they didn't feel powerful enough to ask the headmaster to leave. So there was a sense that you were on show and people were judging a very competitive environment. Quite a few people talk about struggles with food because um, you would look down on, as Olivia says, for taking second helpings of bad food. The eating can become a very problematic thing, I think, for everybody, but especially for women who are dealing with that societal expectations of looking a certain way. And I think for third culture kids, if you've lived in a different place where your body looks very different to everybody around you, you can be very aware of that even before you go to a boarding school where suddenly you are confronted by different sizes, different shapes, and lots of negative judgments about the people who don't have the ideal body shape.
Mm, mm, mm. That always on show judging. Yeah, I think there was something else I was going to bring in, but I've forgotten it. But that idea of judging, it's one of the things I still deal with now is like judging people. I put them on pedestals better than me or less than me. And I
Mm,
see that it's kind of Nick talks about this a bit in Wounded Leaders about how the upper classes have projected down onto the working classes. And I still see that I can still do that with certain people. And what's always interesting is like what you began with about when we tell our stories. As soon as someone tells their story, they're human again. And I take them off the pedestal or I bring them up again.
mm,
And I have empathy and I can feel them again. So, um, what other things have we got on the questions? We've got most of the books in the public eye are UK centric, despite the fact that international students are a fast growing core cohort at boarding school. I think it's 40%, 45% of students now at boarding schools are international students. They're coming from China or Africa. I mean, I went back to my old boarding school a couple of years ago, and there used to just be a handful of children of color, and now it's maybe 40 to 50%.
mm.
And it was like, oh wow, the change that's happened. What, you know, what would you add? I mean, with the books, that they're mainly UK centric, what needs to happen there, do you feel?
But I think that statistic of 40, I think it's 43% in the 2022 stats that the Independent Schools Council puts out, is actually lower than the true figure because talking to people who know children from overseas at school today, a lot of them come over as day pupils and they sort out their own boarding houses. So a bunch of families might send one person from a village or a town to the UK, and that person would set up effectively a boarding house. Homestay is the phrase that's used for it. And
Wow.
so it might be 50% of kids or even higher who are over here. And the expectation for those children, not only do they have the huge burden and losses that a TCK has intrinsically, but then the expectation of that family that saves up ridiculous amounts of money to send the kid to the UK is appalling. Olivia talks about that a little bit in our stories that the parents were convinced that she was going to go back as a doctor or a lawyer or something, some profession that the schooling gave her, along with some of the networking things, and be a real leading part in their community. And so, if you turn out to be a mediocre scholar and you can't do that, or if your boarding school experience breaks you, and one of Olivia's friends, equally from, I think they were from Hong Kong, committed suicide because they could not cope with the parental pressure. What then? You've just found a whole other way of failing. I really feel for these kids. And it's not just the UK, actually. I was talking on Messenger this morning with a friend of mine who has just retired from a special needs school in America, where again, the volumes of children from places like Africa, India, China was outnumbering the people who are born in the US. So it's a global phenomenon. Heaven knows what we're creating by this peculiar kind of colonialism in places overseas.
Mhm. Mm. Linda, anything you'd like to add in there?
Well, something that Tanya Crossman, who's works for Third Culture Kid Training, has said is that often the families don't really realize the implications of sending their children overseas either, and it can become a great source of grief later. She was talking about work she's done with Asian families who tend to be very collectivist and expect the child to remain part of the family, but they send them to a Western style school where the children are taught to be independent thinkers. And it's often a great source of grief for the parents because the children are no longer able to fit in within their own culture. They're almost like third culture kids if they go back home to their own culture. And of course, I don't know about the UK, but in Australia, a lot of the students who come here to school and then on to university actually don't go back. They try to stay here and work here, and it's become a way of the government's trying to change that at the moment, but it has been a way of um, getting entry into Australia and getting a work visa. So it there's all sorts of implications of it that I don't think we fully understood, and I think schools are trying hard. Some schools, international schools, probably do better at supporting third culture kids from different cultural backgrounds within their community. Perhaps they do better than some of the schools, perhaps like the English ones that have grown up with a very proud tradition and they don't want to change. I don't know. That's not my area of expertise.
Mm. Interesting. As you're speaking, I've realized after I left boarding school, jumping out of the fire into the frying pan into the fire, but I became a teacher in an Australian boarding school of
Oh,
all.
did you?
I did, yeah. Toowoomba Grammar School was the where I went to work, and I just went for a term. I asked to go for a gap year for a whole year, but I they just gave me 2 months. I'm so glad I only got 2 months. But there were a lot of the Papua New Guinean chiefs had sent their children
Mm,
to these schools to get educated. They were obviously third culture kids. And I presume they went back, but I don't know because I was only there for a few months. But they were really lovely. But most of them were probably in their 20s because they looked like they were in their 20s. And it was just, yeah, fascinating. But one question which has come up for me quite a lot about boarding schools recently, because I'm doing a lot of research into leadership and emotional intelligence, is that I think it's Daniel Goleman talks about in his work that IQ only accounts for 20% of life successes. The other 80% is emotional intelligence. So for me, the model of sending your child 800 miles away or to another country to get that 20%, it just doesn't make any sense. You're much
no.
better to keep them at home to give them that 80% emotional intelligence, and then there's another study which I've mentioned before on the podcast, the Dunedin study, which followed 1,000 children from the 70s until they were 40. I think they might have done more studies since, but they worked out again who were the most successful after the period of 40 years. And they found that it wasn't IQ, it wasn't socio and economic background, it wasn't wealth, it was emotional intelligence, which predicted who were the most successful. And as Nick said in his book, Wounded Leaders, that's the one thing we're not given in these schools is emotional intelligence. Squash it down. Don't show emotions.
Yeah.
For me, they're irrelevant now. They just, especially as leadership is moving into that emotionally intelligent space. That's what leaders of the future will be. These schools don't have any purpose anymore for me.
Mm.
A bit of a rant there, sorry.
Makes entire sense. I just, it just worries me that the long tail of these schools is really quite impressive. I don't share your optimism that leaders are moving towards valuing emotional intelligence.
Hmm. I don't think they necessarily are, but I think what's happening is that um, AI is coming in and managers, people who have no emotional intelligence, they will become obsolete. Whereas leaders who have vision, who have emotional depth, they're able to connect with their staff, they are the people who will survive. And the schools don't create those. They create managers, they create people who do as they're told, but they don't really have much intuition because they're told, and that's a key part. So I agree, there's going to be they're going to hold on to that. But I just think that they've almost, it's like you're at 20% capability at the moment as a leader. Well, don't you want to get to 100%? Don't you want to be the best leader you can be? So I know I've gone off topic a bit, but um, I'd love for you to talk a little bit about the boarding school survivors workshops. You know, um, you mentioned a little bit because that's how the book came out of that therapeutic setting. Um, y- and this idea of not being surprised that the individuals in your study did not enjoy boarding school.
The boarding school survivors workshop were for me literally life-saving, certainly life-changing. Um, I had a breakdown at the start of COVID, and because the lockdowns threw me straight back into boarding school, and I knew that I could not survive doing that again. Just no. And I found a therapist through the boarding school survivors organisation, and then fairly rapidly went on one of the workshops, which is where the core of the women whose stories we have came from. Um, and it was that understanding that I wasn't alone in damage, that actually there was a lot of common humanity in my experience, um, and that each of us had been wounded. And I still am fairly confident that it's not possible to get through a boarding school experience without developing some degree of wounding, some degree of damage in it. Um, and Nick's work in those, and Ruth Tudor, who runs the women's workshops, um, they are just transformative. All the people who contributed to the book have agreed that all royalties will go to the fund that Nick has set up in order to subsidise people who can't afford the things themselves.
Mm.
And I'm delighted to be a part of in supporting that.
What a great idea. Great idea doing that. Thank you. Linda, anything you'd like to add?
I wish we could have those kind of survivors workshops in Australia. Perhaps we will one day. But yes, right from the beginning, when I first got in touch with Nikki, one of the first things she said to me was that, she was asking everybody if they were going to be part of this project, that the profits would go to support people to attend workshops. And look, I was very happy to do that. I hadn't attended workshops, but I know that the counselling that I've had over the years has made a very big difference to how I understand my experience and helped me to put that in perspective in my life. So I was very happy to be supportive of that aim.
Great, great. So, therapy and third culture kids. What is it that drives, third culture kids who've been to boarding school to therapy as adults? Because I think it's Nick in Trauma, Abandonment, and Privilege talks about how certain people, like the conformists, often won't go to therapy, or if they do, they don't stay very long. What about third culture kids who've been to boarding school?
My experience was that in Nick's terms, I was a combo of crushed rebel, and I suspect that the multiple blows that a third culture kid has might lead them to be more crushed. And I can't remember what Nick says a crushed person is likely to do when it comes to therapy. But for me, my strategic survival personality was absolutely the core of what I thought my life was. It wasn't until COVID that I thought there was anything wrong with me at all. And now I know I was living perhaps a tenth of the life that I could have been leading. Now, what a waste of a life. and a life in which I brought up two children who I really hope I haven't passed on too much of my stuff to. But yeah, I don't know particularly of any compliant third culture kids. I know one or two rebels, but I do suspect most people just became crushed because they have no resilience at all by the time they end up at school.
Thank you, Nicky. Anything you'd like to add to that, Linda?
Well, one thing that we did speculate about in the book, and it doesn't really come out the stories. It's something that would need to be researched. Perhaps people would need to be interviewed about it. I wondered whether third culture kids actually just didn't have the same sense of connection with the schools as perhaps children who've come through multiple generations of boarding. And I know they don't all have that sense of connection to the schools either. But there's perhaps there seem to be more third culture kids who are first in family at the boarding schools. Certainly my parents didn't go to boarding school, so they had no idea about that culture. Perhaps we're less invested in the schools, and maybe that makes it easier to be critical, I suppose. Perhaps we've got less to lose. I don't know. It's a very interesting question. It's something that it would be good to know more about, because it certainly was something that was so clear to us. You know, we weren't surprised that the people who contributed to the book found boarding school was a negative experience because they came from that therapeutic setting. But we were surprised at how many of them were third culture kids. There does seem to be something about that combination of being a third culture kid and being sent to boarding school that is problematic in a way that makes people search out therapy later. And it's not just our book. Nicky's made this lovely little chart at the beginning of the book that demonstrates that third culture kids are overrepresented in many of the other books about boarding school as well.
Mm. Interesting. As we're talking, I'm thinking the biographies that I have, or the well-known people who are third culture kids. One is Chris Whitty, who was the chief medical
Mm.
officer. I don't know if he still is. I think his family were in Africa, and then I think his father was killed while he was at boarding school.
Mm.
And then I'm trying to think, Freddie Mercury.
Mhm.
He was a third culture kid. He grew up in Namibia, possibly, and was sent back to India. So maybe the last question around ACEs and third cultures kids, because I think when we spoke about a year ago, Nicky, we talked about ACEs and how you'd interviewed maybe 100 people, and that I think there was a certain number of ACEs that everyone seemed to have.
Mm. Typically, it was three or four that people turned up at boarding school with, and then boarding school might well add another one or two. So yes, just horrendous. Um, to add hope to that, positive childhood experience, PCE, seems to be very protective against that. You know, if you get a decent number of PCEs, you can knock off one or two of your ACEs, because the consequence of having a high number of ACEs is really horrendous. You know, it puts your suicide risk way up, makes it unlikely that you will succeed in life. I do wonder if there's a link between EQ and recovery from ACEs as well. And the last chapter in the book that Ulrika Envik has written for us, she's a family psychotherapist, I believe currently back in her home country of Sweden, um, talks about how to give your child positive childhood experiences to buffer some of the blows that are likely to come their way, and to retain some of the continuity that Linda was talking about earlier, so that the child stays embedded in the family cultural matrix, to give them a sense of connection. And I think that's really important.
Mm, 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 mm. But Linda, is there anything you'd like to add in there about ACEs and
Yes, well, certainly I was surprised when we started looking at the stories how many ACEs each of us came to boarding school with. And yes, I agree with Nicky. The whole positive childhood experience thing is something I'd love to know more about. I do wonder whether going to boarding school makes it harder to build up that sort of bank of positive childhood experiences, perhaps particularly for third culture kids, because they can't gain those kind of protective factors around participating in the familiar community traditions and things like that if they're in school in England and or Scotland, somewhere in the UK, and their families overseas. um, Certainly, yes, I agree. One of the things Ulrika says that's really important is for parents to really take their children's feelings seriously and to talk to their children about whether or not boarding school's working, and if it's not, to look for other solutions. That's been such an uncommon thing for so many of us, whether we're third culture kids or not, is that it often felt like, never mind how much we told our parents we were unhappy, it felt as if nothing was going to change.
mm, yeah, I think that's one of the things which I've heard over and over the years is yeah, they parents don't listen.
Mm.
And I think there's one person I've interviewed who ran away within 3 weeks and he wasn't sent back. But every other person was sent back that I've ever interviewed or read stories about. I think Clive Woodward, the England Rugby World Cup winning uh, coach, he ran away 3 times from Anglesey all the way to I think it was Lancashire.
Wow.
Long way, 3 times as a 11, 12-year old. So
Tony Blair got to the airport once, as I
he
recall.
got on the plane.
No, he got to the airport. They didn't let him on a plane.
Well, according to this one,
Oh, did he actually get on a? Oh, good kid.
yeah, yeah. According to this one, he actually got on the plane, and he says here that it was only the air hostess came up to him and said, "Oh, I didn't see your ticket." Yeah, I think, but yeah, because I heard it on some article and I thought I'm going to find it. So I bought a few of his books. And interestingly, Blair doesn't talk about it in his biography, in his autobiography. And he says on one of these TV shows in '97, it was the most crazy thing he's ever done in his life, but it doesn't make it into his autobiography.
Mm.
Interesting, that, isn't it?
Mm.
So,
It is
Strategic
interesting.
survival personality alive and well, I would say.
yeah, I think so. So as we start to wrap up, is there anything you'd love to just share that we've maybe not talked about that you feel's in the books that's important to know about?
The bravery involved. Everybody who's put up a story has opened their soul to people, and I'm just blown away by people's bravery and generosity in that. And I really would like to thank those people from the bottom of my heart. And also Suzanne, my ex-therapist, Ro Woodruff, who's written a chapter on how therapy works. Um, Ulrika's work on positive childhood experiences, and I'm still so grateful that Linda came along, because it is her research that has made the book so powerful.
Mm.
Mm.
Thank you, Nikki. Linda.
Oh, I would echo those sentiments. I expressed them at the beginning, and they remain true for me. Just I feel very privileged to have been part of it, and very grateful that people trusted me enough with their stories to look at them and make comment on them. That does take quite a lot of bravery. And as a researcher, it's a really interesting methodology for, I think, what we've done. You know, a lot of people use interviews, but if you read a book that's based around interviews, you get little snippets that the researchers think are important, and they use those snippets to craft a particular story. Whereas in our book, everybody can see what each person's written. So everybody can see how we've used that information to draw the themes together. So it's been a really interesting project for many different reasons. And thank you very much for giving us an opportunity to talk about it, Piers. It's been great.
A pleasure. Well, thank you for writing it. I've really been enjoying reading the book so far. I haven't finished it. I will get round to finishing it, but really loving, certainly Suzanne's chapter about attachment and ACEs and some of the figures there. It's like, wow, the denial, and then some of the stories. It's like, yeah, thank you. Thank you for writing it. So when is the book out?
On the 30th of April.
30th of April, right? And people can buy it now.
It's on pre-order now on Routledge's website and also on Amazon.
Great, great. So really recommend people buy the book. It's really interesting. Even if you've not been a third culture kid, I just think it's so many fascinating stories and aspects of boarding school. And I'll put a link into the description. So please do go ahead and buy it. So thank you so much, Nikki and Linda. I've really enjoyed today's conversation.
Thank you, Piers.
Okay,
Yes,
take
thank you very much.
pleasure.
Thank you.
Bye bye.